Everybody.
Welcome in. My name is Gerri Brehm. I am one of the consultants here at the Executive Advisory, and we are all grateful that you are here. I will also let my colleague introduce herself.
Thank you. My name is Heather MacArthur, and super excited today to talk about conflict. I think I put it in one of our ads that it's right before Halloween, so perfect scary time for us to talk about a spooky topic.
Absolutely. And I think it's a little bit ironic that the two of us are doing it. Well, I wouldn't say you're a fan of conflict.
No.
Heather's just really good at thinking through conflict. And I would qualify myself as lower on the spectrum of wanting to deal with conflict and feeling in control when it happens. So I love this topic because I've learned so much from the model. Actually, Heather's going to be sharing with us today. And it is critical. I mean, we were talking about this earlier of we just keep hearing from our clients all the time, this is my biggest conflict, or this is the biggest challenge. And when you try to dig into that, you just realize there's so many different components that are creating that conflict feeling.
Yeah, for those of you as you're signed in, you're probably thinking through some of the conflicts that you have, and maybe some of the ones that you're supporting your team members through. What's showed up for us with clients, and I'd say it's just continued to build over the years. And the positive side of this that I love is that there's that much more of a demand for conflict, but there's also an expectation that it is done in a way that's productive. And mainly because technology is changing so fast. I think the upside of AI coming in and taking away more and more of the tactical stuff, it's making it more and more about what are your creative ideas and also how are you working with other humans. So the conflict is there. It's this idea of how do you make it creative and productive so that we're debating ideas and not attacking each other. And that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. And there's actually something I just saw the other day. It was Malcolm Gladwell who wrote The Tipping Point. And he was talking about that need for conflict. It actually, if you don't have those uncomfortable conversations with people as a manager, it's actually a sign of neglect. And it just popped for me that moment of if I just let it slide, like, you know what, whatever, I just don't want more drama. We're actually not taking care of the people in our own teams. So I just love that.
Yeah, isn't there, I don't think it was Malcolm Gladwell, I don't know who it was, but this idea of like the opposite of love is not hate, it's apathy.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to that of like, I don't even care enough to get into the conversation.
Right.
Well, what we're going to talk about today is introduce you to the conflict model that Gerri was referencing just a second ago. And this model, I want you to think of it as just like when you're driving, when you're on the road, there's this element of you can't predict the drivers on the road. You can't predict what's going on. I think most of us, as if you're driving, there's an autopilot that turns on. And so that's why they say that most accidents happen within like 5 miles of your home. But we know that I always like to put that imagination out there of like, well, imagine that you just rented a car and you're in a state that you've never been in. And for some reason you couldn't take an Uber, you had to drive. And it was raining and the road conditions were pretty bad. How would you be driving? Well, you'd probably do some version of 10 and 2 for us older folks and 9 and 3 for the youngins. But some version of this is how I drive. My back is straight. I'm checking my blind spot. I'm vigilant and I'm very intentional about what I'm doing. It takes more energy. I find that if, let's say you and I had a conflict or a debate, we may not even notice that it's a conflict because, we're getting along. It's not kicking up any dirt. It was a conversation, and what a fun conversation that was. And my brain is fired up. But a lot of times when I hear people say that they don't like conflict, it's because it feels like a fight. And when it's in that situation, then we can't really autopilot. And so this is what the map looks like. It always starts with the source of the conflict. It's the tangible thing. I don't like how you ran a meeting or whatever it might be. And then it filters through our brain. And the first stop is, am I safe? And so it actually looks at how defensive do I need to be in this situation? And at that point, I decide how much do I trust the scenario, that type of thing. And if there's a lot of trust, then I actually slip on over to objectivity, meaning my brain has the capacity to actually take in not just how I'm feeling about things, but also what you might be going through. I'm actually conscious about this is where people say assume good intent. I'm able to go, what could be your good intention, even if your delivery
Or can I put myself in your shoes? What if I was to look at this through your lens? And if, how am I showing up for you in this conversation?
Yeah, am I showing up maybe
Yeah.
different than how I normally show up because my emotional defense got put up there. But I'm able to sit back and look at it from that observational point. And then from there, go into, let's have a dialogue, let's figure out how to resolve this, let's move forward, and then we get a nice little resolution. This is the nice smooth thing. And what I like about this map is it tells you where you might be, and then you can decide, what do I need to do? Now, the reality is conflict doesn't happen in a straight line. It's always,
It always starts with me. See, I'm right underneath it.
yeah, yeah.
And anybody in my family would agree with that.
Yeah, and I when I get brought in and we're doing like mediation with folks, they always want to talk about the source of the conflict. Oh, it's the fact that, they're not promoting me, or it's the fact that, they were dismissive in the meeting with me. And it's like, okay, but if someone else had done that, you might actually have a little bit more leeway for it. So we really spend time, first and foremost, are you aware when emotional defense gets triggered? And, do you know how to process that? Because the danger is when we ignore that, we pretend like we're over in the strategic action. So when it comes to emotional defense, like, how do you know you're emotionally defensive? And that's tough to do at work because we're always kind of be professional, be calm. I feel like at home, you're kind of like, no, I'm very aware when I'm emotionally defensive. And so is everybody else in the house.
Exactly.
But a couple of things to look for. So one, you develop an aversion, a physical aversion. I remember reading about the guy's name, ex-CIA agent, but he talks about, and I remember I was single at the time, and he talks about, you have an aversion to someone, and the first place to check your feelings, for sure, your gut, but if you're not in tune with that, your feet. And he brings up that like your feet will, if you're standing next to someone, your shoulder will start to move because your feet are kind of walking away from them. But then he went as far to say that couples at night in their bedroom, that if they're, if they don't have an aversion, that they're, unless you got a thing against feet, your feet will touch. And then when there's an aversion, that the feet don't touch. And I was in a relationship at the time, I was like, oh, our feet are not touching. So like, can I touch his? Nope. You don't know what? We broke up 2 weeks later. Anyways, so that feeling of, I want to physically just move away from them.
Right. Just so they know, our feet are basically facing each other. So
I won't put my foot in the screen, but we're very foot forward folks here.
Yeah. And I think some of this aversion comes from, and not to get into the whole therapy of it but there is, how have we experienced conflict in our life? And what patterns did we have to deal with? And what kinds of emotion or garbage, baggage, whatever you might want to call it, have we just continually dealt with and maybe built bad habits about how we think about conflict? So, there's a reason why that aversion actually exists. It's a safety mechanism of, I don't know how safe I can be in this conversation because I don't have the skills to share what I'm thinking, or I don't have the language yet to tell somebody why I'm frustrated about something.
It's a really important part to bring up, is that our emotional defense capability is what's kept us alive. It's this idea of that we're really wired in our brain for physical survival. And so that fight, flight, or freeze, when we get triggered, when our emotional defense gets triggered, that's usually the thing that we start to, the fight, am I going to, tell this person off? The flight, am I just going to avoid them? The hard part is in the workplace, and honestly, in any interpersonal relationship, our physical survival instincts work against us. It's if you're at work and someone didn't invite you into the meeting, and all of a sudden you're either really, aggressive about it, or you just ignore it and you try not to engage in it, it's not going to help you. And so there's a different part of the brain that we have to tap into and get into our interpersonal capabilities, and that ability to step back. It is exactly what you're describing for the objectivity is, can I sit back and actually observe my thoughts? Can I question where they're coming from? If I have an aversion, that's the first thing. Can you at least tune in to having an aversion, and whether that's your feet are not touching? I look for, does my gut get that weird feeling that someone just, I feel like a sense of rejection, or I notice everyone's different. I notice in my shoulders and my head, there's like a little bit of like, no, they're trying to control me. Like, I don't know. They don't get to say who, when, where. So that's a little bit where my anger sits. And this is where my fear sits.
Yeah, and mine's a little bit different because you mentioned fight, flight, freeze. There's also fawn is one of the ones they call out. And that's probably where I default to is I don't want this. So how do I make it go away by making you feel better? I can also do the freeze thing, which, and I certainly have experienced this with folks of, I will freeze you out with questions. I will ask so many questions to sort of parse out what's really at issue here that you can't move forward. It feels like you're having a conversation to somehow get to the facts, but it really is just, I'm going to overwhelm you with words and freeze the conversation.
Yeah. And as you said that, it made me think of what I see as like what I call the professional guard. Like, well, what did you mean by that? Okay. Well, now that you said it, I know the information. I guess things will be different moving forward. And you're sitting there going, we're not having a real dialogue right now. There's a guard up here. We're not actually, you're definitely going, I will take your information, but I'm not going to take you.
Yeah.
And so you have to watch that aversion because when we show up and people may not be able to put their finger on it. It's that passive aggressiveness that you go like something's off. And I've had that before where I'm like, I just kind of have to say like, okay, we're not okay though. Like and sometimes you have to be comfortable sitting in that. And part of that is that it goes back to, we're always co-creating. There is what I'm bringing to it, my experience of things, my expectations of things, and then what this person's doing and what their behavior means to me. The other thing to look for is, and I was bringing this up a little bit, is the fear. And in interpersonal relationships, you could probably list 15 fears, but there's really two that I see showing up as main categories, especially at work: fear of being rejected and fear of being controlled. And so I was coaching a client and she had an assistant that just drove her nuts. And I was coaching with her and we were sitting in the office and chatting in very foot to foot kind of situation. And then her assistant popped in to ask a question and she immediately turned away from the door and started typing and like, yeah, okay, yeah. And then when the assistant closed the door, then she fully turned back to me. And I said, she knows you can't stand her. She's like, no, I'm always professional. I never let on. I'm like, oh my gosh, I just witnessed this. Like she knows. And what I said is like, she's got this fear of control, being controlled by her assistant. She was shocked and like, well, no, because I'm the one in charge. I'm like, yeah, but she's controlling your time in a way. You think that she's not thoughtful. And she's probably getting her fear of being rejected. So then she's coming in trying to fawn. And then you're feeling more controlled and it just starts to feed into it.
And it just flashed on something about, observing yourself, how are you feeling? I think there's also is anyone doing a workaround so they don't have to interact with me? Or am I doing a workaround so I don't have to deal with that individual? And it goes back to, I'm neglecting an opportunity to resolve.
I think that's a great, like, once again, it's tuning into yourself and noticing like, how much am I avoiding being foot forward with this person, even, on camera, but I'm gonna, everyone has their different reasons for having their camera off, but, are you choosing not to have to look? Because that's part of it is I don't want to look in the person in the eye because it's hard to not be sincere and we're afraid of what might be said. And so I feel like the first battle is, can you at least notice that and acknowledge that and know that if your emotional defense got triggered, you are most likely not showing up as your best self with them, even if it's just super guarded. What happens is if we don't address it, if we don't do something to change it, if we don't work through it, if we don't even just process it internally, and maybe we do decide, you know what, this is not that big of a deal. And they just remind me of my cousin Al, and it's not their fault. And I'm just going to, look at it differently. Whatever it is, if we don't sincerely find a way to work through it, then we end up going to apathy. And apathy is a really stressful place to be because it's consciously, I'm going to check out because, I'm going to say like, I don't care. But really subconsciously, I care a lot, but I don't believe I can do anything. So I feel helpless.
Yes. And I was mentioning to Heather earlier, I've got a couple of folks that I've worked with in the recent past who were getting coached because they were coming in hot. And so the feedback was they needed to dial it down a little bit. And in both cases, they immediately defaulted to, well, I just don't care. Like, I'm not going to let anything upset me, that's not bringing their skills and talents to the table. There's a need for them to call out when something isn't going to work, or there's a need for them to push back. just do it in a way that doesn't diminish other people and doesn't in any way shame them. So that apathy they're thinking is, oh, that's just showing that I have control of my emotions. It's actually, no, you've just completely shut them down or stuffed them down.
Yeah, it is a little bit of that. I once again, that frozen kind of, I'm putting my professional shield up. I call it the shoulder pad shield. So I used to be a fan of shoulder. I'm still a fan of shoulder pads, but they'll make their comeback. And so the apathy, what's dangerous is it's dangerous for us because this is where we start to check out. I've heard people say, and honestly, this is what quiet quitting is.
Right.
When we say, quiet quitting is happening, how do we stop it from happening? How dare they quiet quit? And it's like, well, that's just a fancy word for saying they became apathetic. And that's an age-old method of surviving environments that don't feel safe. It's basically, I don't buy that anything I say or do is going to shift or change the environment or situation that I'm dealing with. And so, one, from an individual standpoint, you're setting yourself up to practice and build neural pathways in your mind of being less than what you really bring to the table, is not being your favorite version of how you'd show up on the job. And so you're embedding that this is the way that you show up. So if you do that long enough, I could pluck you from your situation and put you into a new situation, and your brain would hunt for things to tell it it's still in the same situation. Even though it's a very dramatically different, you'd be like, oh, that guy Sam's just like, Tina was. So that's the danger if we're not managing it ourselves, that we don't become kind of the lobster in the pot, that we just start to boil in it. The other side of it is if you're a leader of an organization and you're setting it up where you're not hearing these things, or you're dismissing the feedback that you're getting, whether that's through, I've had leaders get engagement surveys and their first response is like, well, who said that? Let's go manage that. I'm like, no, maybe just sit back and maybe why would they say it? And that maybe is the more important question than who said it. But that apathy, you're definitely getting lower performance. And whose fault is it for quiet quitting? It goes on both sides, but once again, it's co-created. But to me, that's just a fancy way of saying apathy. And it all comes from a lack of trust. And I think we throw that word around. And it seems like this nebulous thing. We know when we have it, we don't know it, we know when we don't have it. But I like to break it into the three sources of trust that I find that, I'm going to go back to this slide real quick. That little line of emotional defense, the more trust you have, the faster your brain can jump over to objectivity and start to look at the bigger picture. The less trust you have, or the more damaged trust, the thicker that line is. And you just end up hanging out and being in emotion, that everything you look at, you're defending yourself against, and you're looking for proof that you're in danger. So the three sources are yourself. And I think this is the most powerful one. If you can trust yourself, if you have confidence and you believe that you can navigate things, and you know what, no matter what, I'll make the right decision for myself. It's a really solid place to come from, and you can navigate a lot. Trust in the relationship. If you have trust in the relationship, what's beautiful is I can be vulnerable. I don't always have to feel great about myself. I think Gerri and I bonded through, we were always, got along working together, but through COVID, we really bonded. And for me, I was not having a lot of trust in myself. And I was able to have the trust into the relationship to be able to admit that and to work through it and have a safe space.
Insane.
To land.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things of, when I hear people say like, oh, you don't bring your personal life to work. I feel like COVID kind of wiped that out. But this idea of, I don't want to have to feel like I have to be the strongest version of myself all the time, because then I think that's what combats against our ability I can admit a mistake. I can say I'm not perfect. I don't know stuff.
But it also goes to the idea, that's where you get to co-create. If I come in and can say, I don't really know how to solve this problem, instead of coming in trying to show like, I can't let anybody think I'm weak. Instead, it's this thing is on my mind. Or as you just talk through something, you start sparking brand new ideas because it's safe in that relationship to, no, ooh, how about this? And you're building on, as opposed to, I can't put myself in any way vulnerable with that other person.
Yeah, and the energy, it basically is like, where did you end up getting to put your energy? And that it kind of leads me to this third one, which is the trust and environment. And I share this a lot in classes. I call it the tale of two teams. And I worked for two different teams. And one team, it was definitely my guard had to be up. You couldn't do anything wrong. You get picked apart in meetings. And I remember, I think about the work that I did on that team. And I think anyone could look at me on that team and go, She's kind of an average performer. I don't think anyone would have been surprised and delighted by the stuff that I was doing. But I spent so much time having to guard myself against doing something wrong that I think I hit in, well, she hits her deadlines. Then I went to this other team and, after some moments of like healing from trauma, and I realized like, oh, it's a very safe environment. No one's expecting you to get things perfect. They're 100% expecting things to take time or to be messy sometimes. And maybe about a year or two into it, I just realized like, wow, this organization, same organization, is getting at least 300%. I'm not a mathematician, but I'm going to mark it as like 300% more productivity and better ideas. None of my energy was going to defending myself
Right.
and guarding myself. It was 100% going to how are we going to do good work? And I think the idea is, you were saying it earlier. I liked what you said about when you have to.
Well, this is your pearl of wisdom. You didn't remember that you shared with me, but I was working with somebody, and they happened to be younger in their career. Everything had looked great. They had been promoted quite quickly, which to me is a little bit of a red flag because they weren't being prepped and trained in the things they needed to do. They weren't given the level of authority that they should have had based on a title and everything else that's been promised. So they didn't have trust in relationship with their manager because they got set up in this situation and it wasn't safe to ask questions of their manager, even some of the other peers. They didn't trust the environment because they weren't set up for success. They didn't have the authority to activate on the changes that were supposed to be happening. So they didn't feel safe anywhere and they started to not trust themselves. And that was the big, and I think the conversation that Heather had shared with me was, if you've got 2 out of 3, you can probably survive.
Mm.
And she was realizing it was eating away at, the one that she had had when she started there. And it was time to figure out a new plan, like take control, get in the driver's seat of her career to say, I need to be in a space where I can go back to trusting myself. I'm not an idiot. I can figure things out. And what kind of environment can I thrive in? And sometimes you don't know what that manager relationship or peer relationship will be until you get into a new organization. But that heightened mindfulness of what should I be looking for so that ultimately you're not eating away at yourself.
Yeah, and it always makes me think of, and I talk about this in the conflict workshop, is this ability to be a thermostat versus a thermometer. And a thermostat sets the temperature of the room, and no matter how hot or cold it gets, it keeps it at like say 70 degrees. The thermometer has to react to the environment. So when I'm coaching someone or helping people through a conflict, if I hear them say, well, you don't understand, Heather, the way that they said this, I had to yell, I had to, shut down, whatever it might be. I get, okay, we're doing thermometer kind of things. We're very, I have to respond to my environment. Now, that said, it goes to this idea of when you have 2 things in place, you're better off. The thermostat, if it's operating, I come from the desert, so I know what 130-degree weather feels like. If your thermostat, just like during the summer, we have these, at least in Southern California, these, electrical
Triple-digit days.
Yeah, triple-digit days, and the electricity shuts down and the power goes out. And it's because it's too much. So as much as, yes, we are in charge of how we think, we choose our thoughts, we decide how we feel about things, we are in charge of that. If the environment is constantly just kind of pressuring us for this, and it's 130 degrees outside because the environment or the relationship is toxic, then we're going to break down. And so we have to be thoughtful about that. We also have to think about what kind of environment are we creating for others. And no matter who you are, you've contributed in some sort of way to make things better for someone. And I guarantee you that you've done something to make it harder for them to stay in thermostat mode. And so there is a little bit of, how do you, one, create work environments where honestly people can expect all 3? That I get that I own my trust in myself.
Right.
And no matter what kind of, bag of self-esteem was, crafted in my childhood, my job as an adult is to figure out how to trust in myself and have that piece of relationship with myself and be at peace with myself. But that we all recognize that we're co-creating with people and we're impacting people and we have responsibility for how we do that. And then especially in the workplace and companies as a whole and leaders as a whole, how are we creating an environment that is psychologically safe, that is inclusive, and that is setting people up kind of like that team number 2 that I talked about, where they really are just excited and focused on, how do I do great work?
Right. And primed to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Well, and the last point that I want to make sure that we emphasize here is that we spend a lot of time on emotional defense. There's a lot into what it takes to navigate through conflict. Some of you are like, I just want to know what to say to this person. I will say, spend some time in emotional defense and figure out where you're at. What I try to call out is most people that I'm coaching tend to want to jump over objectivity when their emotional defense has been triggered because they want to just go, yeah, let's just talk about work stuff and I'm not going to deal with what this felt like. And that's where the passive aggressiveness happens. That's where I just call it gangrene starts growing in the relationship. So to me, if you don't spend some time in realizing your emotional defensiveness and stretching to objectivity, you haven't earned the right to have a conversation because are you really going into there curious about what they have to say and also confident about what you have to say and your side of things?
Right. And I sometimes run into folks, and as I hear them talk through what they want to do at that strategic conversation, it really becomes, oh, so you're trying to prove you're right. It's not about actually solving the problem. It's as long as you're right and that you can get to check the box and go, yeah, we had conflict, but it's all solved now.
Yeah.
Until the next time that's similar or something similar to that bubbles up again.
Well, we've got a question that popped up here is, what do I do if someone's being defensive with me, but they won't admit it? Excellent question. Well, you can't make them. I think what you can do is sit in yourself and be honest about, but this isn't feeling right for me. Because that part you can own. You can't go like, you could say like this, but it's not feeling right for me. And ideally focusing on the behaviors that you're seeing that give you the impression that they're not being honest about, kind of their defensiveness with you. And sometimes what I've done in the past is I can see you showing up with this person this way, and with me, it feels very different. And this is how I'm seeing the difference versus, telling them how they feel, because you can't.
Right. It goes back to the classic I statement. Here's how I'm experiencing it. Here's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes we just have to embrace that, this person isn't going to have that bridge with us right now. So how do we make sure that we're not losing who we are in that? How do we still show up as our best selves? And then you have to gauge, what is this relationship dynamic? And is it just, I think of my friend, Carrie, who we were taking a cooking class, and this one lady wasn't laughing at her jokes, and she was like, I will get her to laugh at my jokes by the end of the night. And I'm like, you need to let it go. So is it just your ego going, they need to like me? Or is it, oh, it's actually getting in the way of the work that we're trying to do with each other?
And there's a couple more questions that have just popped in. At what point during the conflict do you consider resolving or redefining the relationship? And you can correct me, but I think it goes back to that emotional defense thing. If you're not getting that addressed, you can't healthily redefine the relationship unless it's redefined to, I'm never going to talk to you again. I mean, there has to be some acknowledgement of where both of the two individuals are.
I'll say,
or dissolving the relationship.
Yeah. I look at it as 3 strikes and you're out. And I look at it as, if there's a willingness to hear you out, like if there's even a willingness to consider what your experience is, if that's not happening at all, I go up to bat 3 times. And if it's a strikeout, then I'm using sports references, but I'm not a sports person. But if I've gone up to bat 3 times to try to make things a little bit better and it's just not going anywhere, and I've authentically come to it with a desire to make it better and be curious about their experience, not just, you need to listen to me. If there is a curiosity on their end and a desire to shift and change, and I'm seeing an evolution, even if the evolution is small, I can work with that. If it's we had a great conversation, it doesn't change, then I have to go 3 strikes and I'm out.
Yeah. There's one person was talking, this is a much bigger answer than we probably have time for. When is the time to leave the job because there's too much conflict?
Yeah.
And there's a lot packed in that one. So I don't know if you want to, we talked a little bit about that with the trust in self, and not everybody has a luxury to say, this environment doesn't work for me, I've got to get out right now. So it takes a little bit of strategic action, if you will,
Yeah.
of how might I approach that? What works for me, where I'm at financially, where I'm at emotionally.
Yeah, and I just say be precious about the ability to stay a thermostat. And I look at it as, am I learning a skill around navigating relationships that I don't have? I tend to go, it's worth staying here, even if it's a little bit of a fire. Or am I just being exposed to bad patterns? I know how to navigate it, but it's not helping me learn and evolve. That's where I've made a decision to leave.
The next question is actually a great segue for us closing out because of the time, but how do you cover this topic in a training with a group of people as opposed to one-on-one? And it actually works quite well. And I've sat while Heather is teaching one of these. this idea of helping people just even understand, where do I start? If I think about a tricky situation or a conflict I've been in, what's my story? And then you can break that down, and people realizing in groups as they share in partnerships of like, oh, there's a lot of script writing here. I am a really creative person because I got a lot of stuff I baked in there that didn't actually exist. And it can be quite powerful when that's happening in a group setting, because one, you don't feel alone. It validates the experience, but it also gives open to dialogue around that.
Yeah.
And we are there for you when it comes to thought partnership about how that might work for your organization as well.
Yeah, we've done sometimes where it's coaching and it's the relationship that needs the coaching, and it's more of two people, sometimes three people involved. But to Gerri's point, we could chat through what that is. You can reach out and contact us. We are going to be sending information to everybody that attended or registered, so you'll have our contact information. And last but not least, make sure that you check out the upcoming webinar that's going to be on November, and I'm hiding it. 19th. Thank you. Sorry, hiding it. November 19th at 10 a.m. Joe Jockwitz is going to be talking about a right topic for conflict sometimes, performance management puzzle. And especially as we get to this end of year, how do you set that up for success, whether you're your own performance management or you're a manager?
And if you are part of the larger groups where you might be in a conference room watching this together, just go to your point person at your organization for the resources that we've been talking about, so they can get those to you.
Thank you so much for your time. Hopefully you got some tidbits from us. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.